A federal courtroom, a war-hardened single dad in handcuffs, and a judge who suddenly freezes because the man on trial is the boy she once loved beneath a magnolia tree. What happens next will shake the foundations of justice, loyalty, and the second chances we never saw coming. The courtroom was quiet, eerily quiet. Just beyond the thick oak doors of the state courthouse in Baton Rouge, the southern heat simmered, but inside the air was cool and still. Mahogany benches gleamed under the dome lights, and the faint smell of lemon polish lingered. Routine, order, justice. Federal Judge Claire Whitmore stepped through the side entrance and onto the bench with her usual composed stride. Black robe, crisp hair swept into a neat low bun, her expression unreadable, carved from years of neutrality. She had long since mastered the art of detachment. Justice, she believed, was not swayed by emotion. She scanned the courtroom. Prosecutor Tyler Griggs was already seated at his table, shuffling files with the smug efficiency that had made him a rising star in the DA's office. The public gallery was modestly filled, a few curious citizens, 2 local reporters, and 1 elderly man reading a church bulletin. Claire adjusted her robe, tapped the gavel once. "Next case," she announced, glancing down at the docket sheet handed to her by the bailiff. Then she froze. Her fingers stopped mid-turn. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. For a moment, the words on the page blurred, and then they crystallized. Defendant Jackson Dawson. Her heart dropped viscerally, like the sudden dip of a roller coaster that leaves your stomach suspended in midair. It couldn't be. The name echoed in her mind, like a bell tolling from a memory long buried. "Mr. Dawson, please rise." The bailiff's voice sliced through the silence. Claire's eyes lifted slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid of what she might see. He stood, and time fractured. A man in a beige jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, face partially shadowed by a week's worth of stubble, rose with a quiet dignity. Tall, broad-shouldered, weathered. A few strands of silver streaked through his dark hair. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, more than she remembered. But the eyes, those were unmistakable. Gray-blue, intense, intelligent. It was him. Jack. Her Jack. The boy who once stood barefoot beneath the old magnolia tree behind their high school library, reading Supreme Court rulings like they were bedtime stories. The boy who debated constitutional law before he could drive. The boy who had promised under stars and whispered teenage dreams that one day they would both wear black robes and change the world. And now he stood before her, not as a fellow judge, not even as a lawyer, but as a defendant in shackles. Claire's composure faltered almost imperceptibly. But Griggs noticed. He leaned forward, curious. "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" She cleared her throat, gripping the bench like it might steady her spinning thoughts. "Yes," she said. "Proceed." The bailiff read the charges: armed robbery, assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest. Each word was a dagger. Claire kept her gaze fixed on the papers in front of her, afraid that meeting Jack's eyes would cause something in her to shatter completely. But he was already watching her. His expression didn't flinch, not with shame, not with defiance. It was calm, restrained. If anything, there was a trace of something else, resignation. As if he had expected this moment, played it out in his mind, accepted it as inevitable. And yet he didn't look away. When the bailiff finished, Claire forced herself to speak. "Mr. Dawson," she began, her voice steadier than her pulse. "Do you have legal representation?" A pause. Jack's mouth twitched slightly. Not a smile. Not quite. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." Pro se. The courtroom murmured like a stirred hornet's nest. Even Griggs raised an eyebrow. Claire blinked. Jack was going to defend himself. In a case this serious, her judicial training screamed at her. This is reckless. Dangerous. A bad idea. But a deeper voice, one that still remembered the boy under the magnolia tree, whispered, "This is Jack. He always knew what he was doing." She straightened in her chair. "You understand the seriousness of the charges, Mr. Dawson, that if convicted, you could face up to 25 years in prison. I do. And you understand that by waiving counsel, you accept full responsibility for your defense, including legal arguments, evidentiary, objections, and cross-examinations. Yes, Your Honor. Fully." The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogant. It was measured, precise, like a soldier stating his mission parameters before going into battle. Griggs stood. "Your Honor, the state would strongly advise against accepting Mr. Dawson's pro se request, given the severity." Claire held up a hand. "Mr. Griggs, he has the right to self-representation, however unwise it may be. The court cannot deny that right." Griggs hesitated, then sat back down, his lips pursed. Claire turned back to Jack. She had to make it official. "Then let the record reflect that Mr. Jackson Dawson has waived his right to counsel and will proceed pro se. The trial is set to begin Monday." She tapped the gavel. Court adjourned. But no one moved. For a full beat, the silence hung thick with history and unspoken questions. Jack turned slightly as the bailiff approached, cuffing him again. And just before he was let out, he looked back at Claire. Their eyes locked. No words were exchanged, but in that gaze was 1,000 things. "Do you remember? Do you hate me? Do you believe I did it? Will you judge me as a stranger? Or as someone you once loved?" Claire didn't answer, not out loud. But something stirred in her chest. And she knew, with a clarity that chilled her to the bone. This would not be a normal trial. Not for the court. Not for her. Not for Jack. It had already begun to unravel the rules. And something told her. The truth would be far more complicated than anyone imagined. The sound of the cuffs locking was sharper than it needed to be. Jack Dawson didn't flinch. The bailiff nudged him gently but firmly through the narrow corridor behind the courtroom. The echoes of his boots against the tiled floor were rhythmic measured. The air in the corridor was sterile, almost clinical. But Jack didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere. With every step, memories stirred like leaves in a southern wind. He didn't want to go back, but his heart, uninvited, already had. 25 years ago. The sun burned low over the fields behind Riverbend High School, casting long shadows across the lawn. A younger Jack, barefoot and sun-kissed, sat under the sprawling magnolia tree, his back against the trunk, a leather-bound copy of the Federalist Papers open on his lap. "Are you seriously reading that again?" Claire Whitmore stood over him, arms crossed, curls bouncing as she tilted her head. Jack looked up, smirking. "I'm preparing for battle." She sat beside him, the hem of her plaid skirt brushing against his knee. "Against who, Mr. Langston? Against the world," Jack replied. Claire rolled her eyes. "You already made Mr. Langston cry during your argument on the First Amendment. I think the world's safe for now." Jack grinned, flipping the page. "You laugh now. But someday, I'll be in court, and you'll be sitting beside me in your fancy black robe." She turned her gaze to the horizon. "We'll change things. Together." Jack said nothing, but in that moment, under the magnolia, with her shoulder brushing his, he believed in the future, like it was already written. But the future, Jack learned, was made of fragile paper. It burned fast under the wrong match. Back in the holding cell, Jack sat on the metal bench, the chains around his ankles clinking softly as he lowered himself. He ran a hand through his hair, now longer than regulation ever allowed during his Navy days. He let his head rest against the cold wall behind him. A voice stirred in his memory, one he hadn't heard in decades. "You're not like them, Jack. You've got something terrifying. You understand things. It's why they'll either use you or try to bury you. It was Professor Canning, Harvard Law. The man who'd seen through Jack's quiet demeanor the moment he entered Constitutional Theory 101. A war hero in the making, Jack had earned a full ride. Top 1% LSAT score. He was supposed to clerk for a circuit judge. Maybe run for office. Hell, even Claire believed he'd end up on the Supreme Court someday. But that version of his life had vanished the moment he stepped off the plane from Kandahar. It was supposed to be a short deployment. Jack had been part of SEAL Team 6 attached to a classified unit, the kind of missions that didn't make the news or the history books. What came back wasn't just the man, it was the silence, the nightmares, the sense of justice warped by the things he'd been ordered to do, things he still couldn't name in court without black bars appearing on every transcript. He dropped out of Harvard after just one semester back. Couldn't sit through a lecture on moral reasoning when he'd seen children used as shields. Claire never knew why he disappeared, never returned her letters, never answered her calls. He vanished, and she, he assumed, moved on. Now she wore the robe, and he wore chains. Jack rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had been. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps. A guard unlocked the cell. "You got 5 minutes. Visitor." Jack frowned. "Visitor." The guard shrugged. "Kid." "Girl." Said her name's Ellie. His breath caught. Jack stood quickly. "You let her in here. She's just outside the glass. Supervised." Jack exhaled in relief and stepped into the adjacent room. Behind the thick partition, sitting on a plastic chair with her hands folded nervously in her lap, was a small girl with chestnut hair and eyes like morning skies. Ellie, his daughter. 10 years old. Smarter than most adults he knew. And brave, so much braver than she should have to be. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly. The phone pressed to her ear. Jack picked up the receiver on his side. "Hey, sweetheart." Her lower lip quivered. "They said, you're in jail. But you didn't do anything right." Jack swallowed hard. "I didn't, Ellie. I promise." "Then why are they saying it on the news? Because sometimes people don't wait for the truth." She looked down. "Is that lady today, the one in the robe, is she going to hurt you?" Jack blinked. "You mean the judge?" Ellie nodded. "She looked sad when she saw you, like she knew you." Jack hesitated. "We used to be friends. A long time ago. Do you still trust her?" Jack smiled faintly. "I don't know, but I hope she still knows who I really am." Ellie reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I drew something." She held it up to the glass. It was a crayon sketch of Jack standing tall, wearing a cape like a superhero holding her hand. An American flag flew behind them. The word at the top read, "My hero." Jack's throat closed. "Thank you, Ellie," he whispered. "That means more than anything." She pressed her hand against the glass. Jack did the same. 5 minutes. That's all they had. But in that moment, he found his anchor again. Not the law, not the past. Her. As Jack returned to his cell, he thought of Claire, of Harvard, of the night he left, and the letter he wrote but never mailed. Maybe it was time. Maybe the past had been waiting all this time to stand trial. With him. Monday morning arrived cloaked in gray skies and the hush of anticipation. The courthouse parking lot was unusually full. Satellite trucks lined the curb, their antennae reaching skyward like robotic stalks sniffing for scandal. Reporters in tailored suits rehearsed their lines in front of cameras, their voices crisp and eager blood in the water. State versus Jackson Dawson had officially become a media event. Inside, Judge Claire Whitmore sat at her bench with the poise of a statue. Yet behind her composed expression, her mind was a tempest. The room hummed with low whispers, curiosity palpable. No one expected this trial to be anything but another conviction in the DA's growing portfolio. Until Jack Dawson walked into the courtroom. He wasn't wearing a jumpsuit today. In a rare gesture from the court, he had been allowed to change plain navy slacks and a white shirt sleeves rolled up neatly to his elbows. No tie, no blazer, just simplicity and presence. Claire watched as he adjusted the microphone on the defense table. Alone, no legal pad, no stack of notes, no junior associate whispering strategy, just Jack. And his mind. "Ready to proceed, Mr. Dawson?" she asked, voice level. Jack nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." Tyler Griggs rose from his seat at the prosecution table, smug and sharp in a dark blue suit that matched his ambition. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, turning toward the box. "What you are about to hear is not fiction. This is not a misunderstanding or a misidentification. This is a case of calculated violence of a man trained in combat no less, who thought himself above the law." He paced slowly, enjoying the weight of each word. On the evening of August 3rd, at approximately 10 to 14 p.m., the defendant, Mr. Jackson Dawson, entered a gas station on Bayou Road. Security footage shows a man of his build, wearing a dark hoodie, confronting the clerk. Moments later, the register is emptied, and the suspect flees. Less than 10 minutes later, Officer Kane reports a violent scuffle with the same suspect, just 4 blocks away. The officer identifies Mr. Dawson as the man who attacked him when stopped for questioning. The defendant was apprehended shortly after, with minor injuries and no alibi. He turned dramatically toward Jack. This veteran, used his training not to protect, but to harm. The evidence will show that Mr. Dawson is not the hero he pretends to be. Griggs returned to his seat, satisfied. Jack didn't blink. Claire turned to him. "Mr. Dawson, you may give your opening statement." Jack stood slowly, his hands resting lightly on the defense table. He didn't move toward the jury box, didn't try to perform. He simply looked at them. Calm, steady. "I served this country for 15 years, he said. "In places most of you have never heard of. I've lost men I called brothers. I've seen the law ignored when it suited power. And I've seen what happens when good people stop asking questions." He let that hang for a moment. "I didn't rob that gas station. I didn't assault that officer. And I'm not here to ask for pity." He stepped forward once. "But I am here to ask you to listen carefully. Because what you think you see in a blurry video or in a polished narrative might not be the whole truth." He nodded gently. "Thank you." He sat down. The courtroom was quiet. Not stunned, just curious. The mood had shifted just slightly, enough to register. Griggs frowned. Claire kept her expression neutral, but her heart beat just a bit faster. The first witness was called Officer Kane, mid-40s, stocky, crew cut, a scar down his left cheek from an old altercation. He took the stand, with the confidence of someone used to being the authority. Griggs led the questioning. "Officer Kane, can you describe the events of August 3rd? Kane nodded. "I was on patrol, heard dispatch report a robbery on Bayou Road. I spotted a man matching the suspect's description, hoodie, athletic build, walking briskly 2 blocks over. I approached. He turned, got aggressive, threw the first punch. Did you identify him later?" "I did. Jackson Dawson. Same guy. No doubt, none." Griggs smiled. "Thank you." He turned toward Jack. "Your witness." Jack stood, buttoned the single button on his shirt, and approached slowly. "Officer Kane," he began, voice polite but firm. "Do you recall the lighting on that street?" Kane blinked. "What, the lighting?" "On the block where you claimed to have identified me. Streetlights working, I believe so." Jack nodded. "You believe so?" "Not certain. They usually work. But not always." Kane shifted in his seat. Jack stepped closer to the jury box. "And this suspect you approached was his hood up?" "Yes." "So his face wasn't visible?" "Not clearly, but..." "Yet you're sure it was me, despite poor lighting, a hood covering his face, and no verbal confirmation of identity until after the alleged scuffle. Kane stiffened. I recognized the jawline. A soft chuckle escaped someone in the back of the room. Jack turned unfazed. "Officer Kane, are you trained in facial forensics? Have you ever taken a class in cognitive misidentification or suggestibility?" "No. So your identification is based solely on your recollection of a man in a hoodie in the dark under duress." Griggs shot up. Objection badgering the witness. Claire raised a hand. "Sustained." Mr. Dawson rephrased. Jack nodded. "Of course. Officer Kane, would you agree that eyewitnesses can make mistakes?" A long pause. "It's possible. No further questions." Jack returned to his seat. Calm. Measured. Claire stared at him from the bench. That wasn't just clever questioning. That was surgical, controlled, professional. She glanced toward Griggs. He was rattled, barely noticeable, but there. So was the jury. Later that day, Jack requested a discovery motion for the original video file from the gas station surveillance, not the compressed footage submitted as evidence. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Dawson, the defense already has access to the video. I'm requesting the unedited metadata and raw footage. I suspect digital interpolation and possible tampering. On what grounds I used to analyze data for the CIA. I know what doctored footage looks like." A ripple moved through the gallery. Even Griggs sat up straighter. Claire narrowed her eyes. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Dawson." Jack looked her dead in the eye. "It's not a claim, it's a fact." And in that moment, Claire knew this trial was no longer about a gas station robbery. It was about something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous. The courtroom was colder that morning, not in temperature, but in tone. The buzz of the first day had faded, the novelty worn off. This was no longer a local story about a disgraced veteran facing justice. This was a chessboard, and the man in chains was starting to look a lot like the Grandmaster. Jack Dawson sat alone at the defense table, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes scanning the day's agenda like a seasoned litigator. Gone was the stoicism of a helpless defendant. What remained was a presence, controlled, focused, dangerous in the way quiet men often are. Judge Claire Whitmore sat poised on the bench, heart divided between judicial duty and the haunting familiarity of the man before her. Tyler Griggs, the prosecutor, was restless. His opening theatrics hadn't stuck the landing. Now he needed control. Your Honor, Griggs stood straightening his tie. "Before we proceed with the next witness, the state moves to introduce supplemental documentation confirming the suspect's prior military record, including overseas deployment and special forces classification." Jack rose instantly. "Objection." Claire tilted her head slightly. On what grounds? Jack's voice was measured but firm. Federal Rule of Evidence 403. This evidence serves no probative value to the current charges and exists solely to prejudice the jury by invoking combat imagery and emotional bias. Griggs scoffed. "Your Honor, the defendant's background is relevant. He's trained in tactical operations. That knowledge is central to understanding the nature of the assault." Jack didn't flinch. The alleged assault. And knowledge does not equal guilt. If we allow in my military training, why not my academic record? Should the jury also be told I was admitted to Harvard Law? A murmur passed through the gallery. Claire narrowed her eyes. Mr. Dawson makes a compelling argument. Mr. Griggs, unless you can tie the record directly to the method of the alleged crime, Griggs stepped back. Understood, Your Honor. Retracting motion. Claire nodded. Strike the record from consideration. Jack sat down slowly, but his gaze locked with Griggs's for a moment longer than necessary. The game had changed. Later that day, Griggs called Detective Rhonda Hales, the lead investigator on the robbery. Jack stood to cross-examine. Detective Hales, were you present at the scene of the alleged robbery? No, You relied on the surveillance video, correct? Yes. The same video the court has not yet authenticated in original format. Hales hesitated. The file was provided by the gas station owner. And did your department conduct any forensic analysis to verify metadata integrity? Standard chain of custody protocol was followed. Jack stepped closer to the jury box. So no. No digital forensic authentication. Objection, Griggs barked, asked and answered. Sustained, Claire said. Jack held up his hands in surrender, then pivoted. Let's move on. Detective, were there fingerprints recovered from the scene? Yes, but... And were any of those fingerprints matched to me? Pause. No. Jack nodded. No further questions. He returned to his seat. Another crack in the foundation. When court recessed for lunch, the gallery buzzed. 2 reporters scribbled furiously. A woman whispered, "He's schooling that prosecutor like a professor." Claire watched Jack from the bench as he quietly gathered his papers. He hadn't once turned to the gallery, hadn't sought pity. But there was something in his restraint that commanded more respect than any performance. Back in session, Jack made his move. "Your Honor," he said, standing. "The defense requests enforcement of Brady v. Maryland." Griggs sat up. "On what grounds I believe the prosecution is in possession of exculpatory evidence that has not been submitted during discovery?" Claire leaned forward. "Mr. Dawson, are you accusing the state of withholding evidence?" Jack's eyes didn't waver. "Yes, Your Honor." Gasps fluttered through the courtroom. Griggs stood. "Your Honor? That's an outrageous claim. The state has complied with every discovery deadline." Jack opened a manila folder. "Then perhaps you can explain why Officer Kane's initial radio dispatch timestamp does not align with the official timeline submitted in evidence." He held up a printed log. "This dispatch log shows Kane reporting the suspect heading north at 10:15 p.m. Yet the affidavit lists the suspect moving south on Bayou Road." He placed the second document beside it. "Both cannot be true." Claire looked visibly disturbed. "Mr. Griggs, do you have an explanation?" Griggs fumbled. There may have been a clerical. Jack raised a hand. "No, Your Honor. This isn't clerical. It's a Brady violation. The original dispatch log was not included in the evidence package." Griggs's jaw tightened. "We didn't think it was relevant." "You don't get to decide relevance, Mr. Griggs," Claire cut in. "You're obligated to turn over any potentially exculpatory material. That's not a courtesy. It's the law." Jack stayed silent, letting the moment hang. Claire took a breath. "I want a full accounting of all dispatch materials by 9 a.m. tomorrow. No exceptions." Griggs nodded stiffly. Jack's expression didn't change, but in his stillness there was momentum. After court adjourned, Jack was led down the hallway in shackles again. But the way people looked at him had changed. He wasn't just a defendant now. He was a man who knew the system better than the system wanted to admit. A man who could dismantle an entire prosecution with a single clause from a dusty ruling. As the guard guided him into holding, Jack glanced up at the security camera in the hallway ceiling. He didn't speak, but he thought, "They're watching. Let them. Because this time, I came prepared." Back in her chambers, Claire sat alone. She reached into her drawer and pulled out an old, yellowed envelope. Unopened. The letter Jack had sent 20 years ago, postmarked from Virginia. It had arrived 2 weeks after he vanished from Harvard. She'd never read it. Never had the courage. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid it open. Inside, Jack's handwriting. "Claire, if you're reading this, I didn't disappear because of you. I left because of me, because some things I've seen I can't bring into the world you believe in. But I promise you, I will find my way back. When I'm whole. When I'm worthy of that bench beside you again." Her throat tightened, and she knew he hadn't come to court to prove his innocence. He'd come to finish what they started, under that magnolia tree. That night, Claire Whitmore didn't sleep. Not really. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the plaster swirl of her bedroom ceiling, the fan spinning slow above like the hands of a clock, unwilling to move forward. She had spent her adult life mastering the art of stillness, of keeping chaos out by staying composed within. But Jack Dawson had always been her one exception, and now he had returned. Not as the dreamer under the magnolia tree, not as the brilliant teen who could quote Roe v. Wade and Marbury versus Madison in the same breath, but as a man in chains, standing in her courtroom, staring at her with the same calm fire that once made her believe the world could change. The letter lay open on her nightstand. Its edges were worn, the ink faded, but intact. She read it again, though by now she could have recited every word by heart. He had written it with no illusions, no excuses, just truth. I left because some things I've seen I can't bring into the world you believe in. That line haunted her the most. What had he seen? What had broken him so completely that the boy who once memorized the Constitution for fun, who once drew mock Supreme Court rulings on napkins, had walked away from Harvard, and her without a word? She'd spent years resenting him, telling herself he was a coward, that he'd chosen war over love, that he was just like every other man who underestimated her ambition. But now, watching him in court, dissecting constitutional law with more grace than most seasoned attorneys, she realized she had been wrong. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been surviving something far greater than heartbreak. The next morning, Claire sat in her chambers, early, fingers wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone cold. Her clerk tapped lightly and entered. "There's someone here to see you, Judge." "Who?" The clerk hesitated. "Her name's Ellie Dawson. Says she's the defendant's daughter." Claire blinked. "She's alone." "Yes, ma'am. Said she just wants to give you something." Claire stood slowly. "Send her in." A moment later, the door creaked open. A small girl, no older than 10, stepped in, clutching something in her hand. Brown hair braided neatly, freckles across her nose, eyes wide and impossibly blue, just like his. "Good morning, Ellie," Claire said softly. The girl walked up to her desk and placed a folded sheet of paper on the corner. "I drew this last night," she whispered. "I thought maybe you should have it." Claire opened it. It was a child's drawing, crude but powerful, a courtroom roughly sketched. A tall man in a white shirt stood alone at the center. Behind him, an American flag. And sitting above, behind a big desk, was a woman in a judge's robe, drawn with a small red heart over her chest. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, "Please see him the way I do." Claire's throat tightened. She looked up. "Ellie, do you know what's happening to your father?" The girl nodded. "He said people might try to say bad things about him, but he told me to always trust truth over noise." Claire knelt beside her. "Your father is a very brave man." Ellie smiled. "He always says I'm the brave one." Claire hugged her gently like a whisper, and for the first time in years, the judge felt the woman underneath stir. Court resumed an hour later. Claire took her seat, but the gavel felt heavier in her hand. Across the room, Jack looked up at her. For the briefest second, their eyes locked. This time, she didn't look away. That afternoon, the prosecution called a surprise witness. Jason Varnes, a gas station attendant, who claimed to have recognized Jack Dawson from a previous visit a week before the robbery. "I remember him," Varnes said confidently. "He came in late. Same build, same voice. I'd bet my paycheck on it." Jack stood. "Your Honor, I request leave for immediate cross." Claire nodded. "Proceed." Jack approached slowly, arms folded. "Mr. Varnes, how many customers do you see in a week, a few hundred, give or take?" "And you remember all their voices?" "No, but his was distinct." Jack tilted his head. Distinct how gravelly. Calm, like someone who'd seen things. Jack turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, would you consider that a forensic method of identification, gravelly and calm? Griggs objected, but Claire let it ride. Jack continued. Mr. Varnes, are you aware that you once applied for a Navy enlistment and were rejected on mental fitness grounds? Varnes flushed. That's personal. Were you or were you not quoted in a social media post last year, saying, and I quote, "Seals think they're gods. One day someone should humble them." Griggs shot up. Objection, irrelevant, character assassination. Jack didn't blink. I'm establishing motive for bias. Claire hesitated, then nodded. I'll allow it. The jury watched Varnes squirm. No further questions, Jack said quietly. During the break, Claire stepped outside and found herself near the magnolia tree. It was the same type that had shaded her and Jack back in Riverbend. Its waxy leaves, its white blooms, all unchanged. She leaned against its trunk just for a moment, and in her mind, she saw them again, barefoot, idealistic, unafraid. Two kids who thought justice was a sword they could wield together. But now, justice was a machine, and Jack was stuck in its gears. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number. Jasmine Cole, a young voice answered. This is Judge Whitmore. I'm not speaking to you officially, but off the record, I suggest you re-examine your client's witness list. Look into Jason Varnes. A pause. Is there something I should know? Claire whispered. His record smells like rot. You'll know it when you see it. And she hung up. That night, Claire sat with the drawing Ellie gave her taped to the edge of her desk. It reminded her of something she'd forgotten. Justice is not only about law, it is also about humanity. And sometimes, the robe must listen to the heart inside it. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the bailiff wheeled in the cart with the AV set up. At the center of today's proceedings stood a 42-inch monitor, black and unblinking like an oracle yet to speak. Judge Claire Whitmore sat straighter on the bench. Everyone could feel it. This was the moment. The linchpin of the state's case, the surveillance video. Tyler Griggs stood face taut, but confident. Your Honor, the prosecution will now play the original footage submitted into evidence, as captured by the security system at Bayou Gas on August 3rd. He turned to the jury with theatrical restraint. We believe this video alone will confirm what our testimony has already laid out. The lights dimmed further. The video began. Grainy. Low resolution. Black and white. A timestamp ticked across the upper left. 10:14 p.m. A figure in a dark hoodie entered the frame from the left, moved toward the counter. The cashier flinched. There was no audio. The figure gestured, then leaned over the register. The camera shook. Then the suspect fled off screen. End of clip. Griggs let the silence linger. He turned to the jury. As you can see, the suspect's height, build, gait all consistent with the defendant. And while the face is obscured, the circumstantial match is compelling. Claire looked toward Jack. He hadn't moved. He stood slowly, buttoned his sleeve with calm precision, then stepped forward. Permission to approach the monitor. Claire nodded. Granted. Jack walked to the screen. Slowly, deliberately. He turned to the jury. This video is silent, he began. But not because it has no voice. It's silent because someone chose it to be. He tapped the screen gently. Let's talk about the timestamp. The jury leaned forward. This overlay format. He pointed to the numbers. It's from a Hikvision DVR system commonly used in small businesses. But here's the issue. The font used here wasn't part of their firmware until 2019. The system at Bayou Gas was installed in 2015. Griggs stood. Objection. Speculation. Jack turned. I'd like to submit a technical manual and firmware logs from Hikvision's public repository. Your Honor, all verified. Claire raised an eyebrow. Admitted into evidence. Proceed, Jack continued. Now see the camera jitter. That's compression artifacting. Normal for low res. But here, he pointed to a 2-second frame. Where the figure turns, we see an unusual blur pattern. This is a signature of frame interpolation, where software adds fake in-between frames to smooth motion. He paused, letting it sink in. That means the file was re-encoded, not raw. And when video files are re-encoded, metadata is overwritten or erased, which violates the chain of custody. He turned back to the jury. Let me say that again, the state's primary evidence is not only edited, but digitally manipulated. A ripple of gasps spread across the room. Griggs was on his feet. This is a distraction. The video shows the suspect in the act. Jack didn't miss a beat. Does it? Let's do a side-by-side. He pulled up a still frame. The suspect in the hoodie. Then Jack did something no one expected. He took off his button-up shirt, revealing a tight, military-style undershirt beneath. He stepped into the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, may I demonstrate? Claire hesitated. Be brief. Jack reached into his trial bag and pulled out a hoodie, the hoodie recovered in the arrest. He put it on. Then, facing the jury, he walked the exact same path as the suspect in the footage. Same gait. Same motion. Then he pulled up a still from the night of his arrest, taken from the police cruiser camera. Slightly different shoes, different stance, shorter stride. Facial recognition couldn't match the suspect to me. Neither could height analysis. And this, he pointed to the grainy hoodie figure, was never verified using forensic motion tracking, because no one bothered to. Jack turned to the jury. I was arrested because I looked like a shadow in a video. Not because someone saw me. Not because my DNA was found. But because I fit the story. He let the hoodie fall to the floor, then calmly walked back to his table. Claire took a deep breath. Mr. Griggs, your rebuttal. Griggs was flushed. We stand by the video as admissible. The defense is leaning on technicalities. Jack didn't rise. He just said, the Constitution is a technicality. So is the truth. At recess, reporters flooded the steps outside. He just dismantled their evidence like it was a middle school science fair. One whispered. He used CIA-level analysis, another added. Who is this guy? Inside her chambers, Claire sat alone again. She couldn't stop shaking her head. She'd known Jack was brilliant. But this was something else. This was surgical. Like watching a man peel apart lies with the calm of someone who'd lived through real war and now saw legal combat as child's play. She stared out the window and whispered almost involuntarily, who did we let fall through the cracks? That night, a storm swept over Baton Rouge. Rain hammered the courthouse windows like angry fists. Jack sat in his holding cell, staring at the ceiling, motionless. He wasn't thinking about strategy anymore. He was thinking about why someone would alter video evidence in the first place. Because if someone had gone to those lengths, then this wasn't just a mistake, this was a setup. And someone out there wasn't just trying to convict him, they were trying to erase him. The courtroom felt tighter than usual. Not physically, but in atmosphere. Tense, compressed, like every molecule of air was waiting to snap. Claire Whitmore could sense it from the bench. The rhythm of the trial had changed. Jack Dawson, once a man in shackles, was now guiding the courtroom like a conductor with a silent baton. And now the stage was his. Call your next witness, Claire instructed. Tyler Griggs stood. The prosecution calls Officer Eric Kane. Jack straightened, no paper in front of him. Just memory, just clarity. A stocky man in his early 40s approached the stand. Buzz cut. Tactical vest peeking beneath a sport coat. He walked like a man used to being the biggest voice in the room. He was about to meet someone quieter, but far more dangerous. Kane was sworn in, then began under Griggs's direction. I was on patrol near Bayou Road. Received the APB of a robbery in progress. About 10 minutes later, I spotted the suspect, hoodie male, average build, moving fast. I approached. He became aggressive, physically resisted. I attempted to detain. There was a struggle. Griggs leaned in. "And you identified the suspect?" "Yes. He was arrested shortly after. That man, right there." Kane pointed toward Jack. Griggs smiled. No further questions. Claire nodded. "Mr. Dawson, your witness." Jack rose slowly, walking without notes, like a man who didn't need to plan because he knew. "Officer Kane," Jack began, voice smooth as Riverstone. "You said you identified me during the incident. Is that correct?" "I did." "In low light, with a hood pulled over the head." "Yes." Jack took a step forward. "Do you wear a body cam?" "Yes." "Did it record the encounter?" Kane shifted. "The battery was low. It cut out during the altercation." Jack nodded. "Convenient." Griggs stood. "Objection." "Sustained," Claire said, but her voice was wary. Jack turned back to Kane. "Let's talk about procedure. When you approached the suspect, did you announce yourself?" "Yes." "And did you inform him of his rights?" "I read his Miranda rights after placing him in cuffs." Jack raised an eyebrow. "After the arrest?" "Yes." Jack paused. "Officer Kane, are you familiar with the 1966 Supreme Court ruling Miranda versus Arizona?" "Yes." "And the ruling states that once an individual is in custodial interrogation, that is under arrest, or in a situation where they are not free to leave, the Miranda warning must be given prior to questioning." "Correct." Kane blinked. "Yes. Did you ask me any questions before placing me under arrest?" A pause. The air shifted. "I asked for identification, which I refused." "Correct. You were uncooperative." "Uncooperative, or asserting my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." Griggs barked. "Objection." Claire didn't respond immediately. Jack continued, "Because if I was under custodial restraint, and I was, and you asked questions before issuing Miranda, then any statement or silence could not be legally admissible. That would violate not only Miranda, but also my constitutional rights under the Fifth and Sixth Amendments." Kane was now visibly uncomfortable. Jack turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't technical. This is the Constitution. And this officer, either through negligence or intent, violated it." He turned back. "Officer Kane, what department do you work for?" "Baton Rouge PD. Have you ever had a prior complaint filed against you for use of force or procedural misconduct?" Griggs shot up. "Objection irrelevant." Jack raised his voice, calm but firm. "It speaks directly to credibility, Your Honor. I'm establishing a pattern." Claire looked at Kane, then at Jack. "Overruled. Answer the question." Kane's jaw twitched. "Yes. One complaint. Dismissed." Jack cocked his head. "Not two." Silence. Jack reached into his folder, pulled a copy of a public records request. "I have documentation here of 3 complaints filed against you in the past 5 years. 2 dismissed, 1 under investigation." "Care to explain?" Kane clenched his jaw. "Those complaints were unfounded or just closed, quietly." "Same thing." Jack stepped forward slower now, like a boxer who smells blood. "Tell me, Officer Kane, do you feel your judgment is ever clouded by adrenaline, by bias, by assumptions?" Griggs' objection. Claire overruled. Answer the question. Kane stared at Jack. "No, I do my job." Jack stopped. His voice dropped. Not louder, but sharper. "Then why is your incident report time-stamped after the medical treatment report for my injuries?" Dead silence. Kane looked like he'd been slapped. Jack continued. "The paramedics report being dispatched at 10:36 p.m. You logged your report at 10:52. That means you documented after I was treated." after the bruising, after the photographs, he turned to the jury. And that means the narrative may not have come from fact. It may have come from damage control. In the gallery, people leaned forward in their seats. A retired lawyer in the third row whispered, "This kid's eating him alive." Claire looked down at her bench, her fingers flexed. This was no longer a cross-examination. This was an indictment of process. Jack walked slowly back to his table. No further questions. Kane stepped down, but his posture had changed. Smaller, less certain. Griggs scribbled something furiously on his legal pad. Jack sat, calm, like a storm that knew it had just torn something open. Claire called a recess. In her chambers, she paced, slow, methodical. The walls were closing in, not from pressure, from truth. How many times she wondered had she accepted a report as gospel because it came with a badge? How many cases never had a Jack Dawson smart enough, trained enough to fight back? She looked at Ellie's drawing again, taped now to her bookshelf. Please see him the way I do. She did. God help her, she was starting to. That night, Jack sat in his cell staring at a water stain on the ceiling. He wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because he knew something that most people never understood about truth. It wasn't enough to prove they were wrong. He had to prove that the system itself had forgotten how to be right. By the third day of trial, the courthouse had become a living organism, breathing in whispers, exhaling judgment. Reporters lined the marble hallways, like vultures, microphones poised. Every recess turned into a press conference on the courthouse steps. But inside, the temperature of the trial was changing. The jurors no longer looked at Jack Dawson as a headline. They watched him as a man. And Claire Whitmore, federal judge, daughter of a prominent Louisiana attorney, sworn guardian of impartiality, found herself staring not at the charges on her docket, but at the quiet girl seated behind the defense table. Ellie Dawson. She was always there. Small hands folded back, straight a school sketchbook balanced on her knees, her hair in braids, her eyes fixed on her father. That morning, as the courtroom filled, Claire noticed Ellie had drawn something. At first glance, it looked like a simple child's doodle, but something about the way Ellie hunched over the paper shoulders, curled inward, lips pressed tight, stopped Claire cold. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Claire adjusted her robe. "Mr. Griggs, please call your next witness." But her mind flickered back to the drawing. Griggs launched into his direct examination of a forensic technician. The testimony was dry, all about chain of custody forms and drive imaging protocols, words that usually lulled Claire into a neutral flow. But today she was distracted. She kept glancing at Ellie, at the colored pencils spread across the girl's lap. Jack noticed too. He leaned slightly toward his daughter, during a sidebar break, whispering something soft. She looked up at him and smiled, a brief flash of innocence, in a room heavy with suspicion. During recess, Claire left the bench, and against every instinct she'd honed in, 20 years of law, walked down to the gallery. "Ellie," she said softly. The girl blinked up at her, surprised. "Yes, ma'am." Claire crouched, mindful of the robe. "May I see what you're drawing?" Ellie hesitated, then turned the paper around. It took Claire's breath. The drawing showed the courtroom rendered with painstaking detail, the wood paneling, the jury box, even the ceiling fans. At the center sat Jack, drawn not as a criminal, but as a soldier, broad shoulders, upright posture, a tiny American flag pinned to his shirt. Above him, a banner of crayon stars and stripes stretched like a halo. And on the bench sat a woman in black robes, but Ellie had drawn a heart, not a gavel, on the desk in front of her. At the bottom, in block letters, "Daddy is a hero. Please help him." Claire's throat constricted. She forced a smile. "You're very talented." Ellie shrugged shyly. "I just draw what I see." Claire touched the corner of the paper. And what do you see? The girl looked at her eyes solemn. A good man. A dad. Not what they're saying. Claire exhaled slowly. You must be proud of him. I am, Ellie whispered. Even when people aren't. Claire rose, smoothing her robe. Thank you for showing me. She walked back to chambers, but the image followed her, burned into her mind. Back in session, Jack stood to cross-examine the forensic technician. Sir, did you personally extract the gas station's surveillance hard drive? No. It was provided to me by Detective Hales. Did you verify its hash values against the DVR's internal checksum? The technician blinked. We don't typically. You don't typically verify for primary evidence in a felony trial. Griggs objected, but Jack was relentless. No further questions, he said at last, sitting down with quiet precision. The jury shifted, another seed of doubt planted. Claire tried to focus on procedure, but her mind kept drifting to Ellie's drawing. When she first donned the robe, she promised herself she would never let emotion color her rulings. Her father, a lawyer of the old school, had drilled it into her. The law is not about people, it's about order. But here, sitting in her courtroom, was the living contradiction. Jack Dawson. Once the boy she had believed in. Now the man who had built a fortress of silence around his pain. And yet behind him, a small girl who still believed he was a hero. Was justice really blind if it refused to look at the human cost? That evening after court adjourned, Claire lingered in her chambers. She took the drawing Ellie had given her earlier and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk, right beside the docket schedule. For a long time she stared at it. It wasn't just a child's plea, it was a mirror. She saw herself in that courtroom decades ago, sitting in the gallery as her father argued cases, believing in a system that could be fair, that could be kind. Had she lost that? Or had the system trained it out of her? Downstairs, Jack sat in his holding cell. A guard passed by, muttering about that little girl. Jack closed his eyes. He thought of Ellie's drawing, too. She'd shown him before, handing it to the judge. He had wanted to tell her not to, wanted to shield her from the weight of adult battles. But part of him knew Ellie had more courage than most people in that courtroom combined. She was the one thing he couldn't let the system break. Later that night, as thunder rolled over Baton Rouge, Claire opened her laptop and began searching through sealed motions from the prosecution. What she found made her heart skip. A sealed evidentiary supplement, a name she recognized from Jack's old deployments, and a note, sensitive classified source. She sat back, pulse quickening. Someone wasn't just prosecuting Jack. Someone was protecting something bigger. And Claire realized this trial was no longer just about a robbery. It was about secrets that wanted to stay buried. She looked once more at Ellie's drawing pinned above her desk, the heart over the judge's bench. And for the first time in years, Claire wondered, if justice has a heart, what does it demand of me? Claire Whitmore sat alone in chambers, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the only sound accompanying her breath. The walls around her were lined with plaques, degrees, citations from the American Bar Association, all evidence of a life lived by the book. Yet none of them could quiet the storm now brewing in her chest. She'd always believed in law as sacred order, that if followed with diligence and impartiality, justice would prevail. But Jack Dawson had cracked something in her, not with anger, not with guilt, but with a kind of grace under fire she hadn't seen in decades, a man surrounded by accusation, and still he stood tall, not in defense of himself, but in service of a deeper truth. And Ellie, her drawing still pinned above Claire's desk, was a daily reminder that this case wasn't just legal. It was human. Deeply, painfully human. That morning, court was called to order. "Call your next witness," Claire instructed, but the prosecution surprised them all. "We request a recess until this afternoon," Your Honor, Griggs said tightly. "One of our key witnesses is unavailable." Claire didn't miss the tension in his jaw. He was stalling, buying time. The foundation of his case, once seemingly unshakable, was cracking. "Recess granted," she said. "Court will resume at 2 p.m., she gavelled out. But instead of heading back to chambers, she took a detour. To the hallway. To a young woman seated quietly on a bench, flipping through a legal pad covered in yellow post-it notes. "Ms. Cole Claire said." Jasmine Cole looked up, startled. "Your Honor, walk with me." They stepped outside into the humid air of late-morning Baton Rouge. Claire didn't speak for the first few steps. "I know this is highly inappropriate," she finally said. Jasmine raised a brow. "So, this is off the record." "Very." Claire stopped beneath the courthouse's marble columns. "There's a witness on the prosecution list, Daniel Moss." Jasmine nodded. "He's been listed as a last-minute character witness. Supposedly saw Jack acting suspicious days before the robbery." Claire's eyes narrowed. Daniel Moss was dishonorably discharged from military intelligence in 2013. He's not just unreliable, he's dangerous. Jasmine blinked. "I didn't know that." "You do now. Why are you telling me this?" Claire looked her dead in the eyes. "Because I believe in law. But not when it's being used to bury the wrong man." Back in the courtroom, Jasmine leaned over to Jack during a lull in the proceedings. "Daniel Moss." "Ring any bells?" Jack's jaw tightened. "He was my squad's surveillance tech. Got caught falsifying signal data during a recon mission in Fallujah. I reported him. He swore he'd get even." Jasmine exhaled. "He's listed to testify against you." Jack didn't blink. "Then let's make sure the jury hears why he wants to." That afternoon, Griggs strode into court with a thin smile. The state calls Daniel Moss, a wiry man in his 40s with close-cropped hair and the restless energy of someone who'd had too much coffee or too many secrets, took the stand. He spoke smoothly. "I saw Jack Dawson near the gas station days before the robbery. He seemed agitated, talking to himself." Griggs leaned in. "And in your opinion, was he acting erratically?" "Yes." "Like a man under pressure?" Jack rose. "Permission to cross." Claire nodded. He approached slowly, eyes locked on the man in the witness chair. "Mr. Moss, you served in Iraq, correct?" "Yes. Under my unit's command, briefly." "And were you court-martialed for falsifying intelligence reports?" Griggs stood. Objection irrelevant. Jack turned to Claire. "Goes to motive and credibility." Claire nodded. Overruled. Moss shifted. "That was a misunderstanding. I was under stress. Is that also why you threatened me in a post-deployment psych eval for?" "The truth isn't yours to expose, Dawson. I'll see you burn before I let you bury me." Gasps in the courtroom. Griggs turned pale. Jack walked to the jury box. "This man isn't a witness. He's a grudge holder, a liar trying to rewrite history." He looked at Moss again. "You wanted revenge, and you got it until today. No further questions." Claire recessed court early that day. From the bench, she looked at Jack for a long moment before standing. She almost said something but didn't. Instead, she returned to chambers and closed the door behind her, like it was heavier than it had ever been. She sat at her desk, staring at the drawing pinned above. There was a knock. She turned, expecting her clerk, but it was Jack, in cuffs, flanked by a quiet bailiff. Claire stood slowly. "This isn't procedure. I asked to see you. Just 5 minutes." She looked at the bailiff. "Wait outside." The door clicked shut. They stood in silence for a beat. Jack finally spoke. "You always wanted to change the system from within." "Remember," Claire's voice cracked just slightly. "Yes." Jack nodded toward the drawing. "You're already doing it." She exhaled. "You think I'm not scared, that I don't feel the weight of every choice." He stepped forward. "I don't want sympathy, Claire, just the truth." They locked eyes, and for a moment they were 17 again. under the magnolia, dreaming about justice and Harvard and how they'd fix the world. But now the world was on fire, and they were standing in the ashes. Claire broke the silence. I'm not supposed to care. Jack smiled bittersweet. That's how they win. He turned to leave but paused. I didn't come back into your life to make it harder. She stared at his back. Then why did you come back? He looked over his shoulder. To remind you who you used to be. And then he was gone. Claire sank into her chair, hand trembling slightly. She looked up at the heart in Ellie's drawing. It wasn't red. It wasn't dramatic. Just a small penciled shape. Delicate. Real. And maybe for the first time in her career, she realized it was okay to let it beat. The storm hit at 3:27 p.m., not outside, inside. In the form of a new witness, Tyler Griggs dropped like a bombshell onto the courtroom floor. Your Honor, he said, voice almost smug, the state would like to call a previously unavailable rebuttal witness, Miss Tara Velez. Jasmine Cole's brow furrowed. Jack glanced toward the gallery face, impassive, but his pulse began to thrum. Claire narrowed her eyes. Mr. Griggs, this witness wasn't listed during discovery. Griggs nodded coolly. She contacted us yesterday. She claims to have seen the defendant at the crime scene from a nearby alleyway. Jack stood. Your Honor, this is a violation of Brady and Jenks. No time for vetting, no opportunity for rebuttal. Griggs lifted his hands. We're within the court's discretion. Given the relevance, Claire exhaled sharply. She may testify. But tread carefully, Mr. Griggs. This court does not tolerate trial by ambush. A woman stepped into the witness box, early 30s. Nervous. Her eyes darted everywhere but Jack's face. Claire tilted her head. You understand you're under oath. Ms. Velez Tara nodded, lips tight. Griggs began. Ms. Velez, please tell the court what you saw. Tara looked down, then up. I live 2 blocks from the gas station. That night, I was walking home. I saw a man run out from the store. He pulled off his hood. It was him. She pointed. It was Jack Dawson. Jack didn't blink, but Jasmine did. Something wasn't right. Griggs beamed. To be clear, you personally saw him with his face visible? Yes. Thank you. Jack stood. Cross-examination. Claire nodded, tense. Jack approached slowly, like a soldier walking into a minefield. He knew Griggs was gambling on desperation, but desperation left fingerprints. Miss Velez, Jack said gently. Do you recall the exact time of this alleged sighting, a little after 10? Can you be more specific? 10. 15, maybe. Jack nodded. And the lighting in the alley? It was dark, but the streetlight was working. He paused. Would it surprise you to learn that the streetlight on that corner has been out since July 24th? Griggs rose. Objection assumes facts, not an evidence. Jack held up a document. City maintenance reports. I'd like to submit them. Claire took the papers, scanned them, and nodded. Entered into evidence. Jack turned back to Tara. So, no light. Tara shifted. There was ambient light. Jack raised an eyebrow. From the gas station that's partially blocked by a dumpster and a chain-link fence. Silence. He stepped closer. Miss Velez, have you ever met Tyler Griggs before this case? She hesitated. No. Jack pulled another document from his folder. Then, how do you explain this Venmo transaction from 2 days ago, $600 labeled favor due, from an account linked to the same phone number you registered on your juror disqualification form last year? The courtroom gasped. Claire's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. Griggs stammered. Your Honor, this is out of context. Jack's voice cut through the chaos. I move to strike this witness's testimony in its entirety on grounds of bribery and perjury, and I request the court instruct the jury to disregard. Claire's voice was steel. Request granted. Jury will strike all statements made by Miss Velez from the record. She turned to the bailiff. Escort Ms. Velez into holding. She's now a subject of investigation. Griggs went pale. The jury watched it, all eyes wide, trust crumbling. Jack turned back to his seat, calm but electric. The tide had shifted. The water was pulling hard in the other direction now. Outside the courthouse during break, the press exploded. Defense just exposed a bribed witness. Prosecutor caught linked to payment. Is the state's case collapsing? Inside her chambers, Claire stared at her reflection in the dark window pane. She knew what was coming. If this went public, and there would be calls for an investigation, possibly a mistrial. But worse, if she didn't hold the line, justice would be the one on trial next. Back in session, Jack stood. Your Honor, I move for prosecutorial misconduct based on today's events. Claire's voice was slow, deliberate. That motion is noted. This court will rule after further review. She turned to the jury. But for now, we continue. Jasmine leaned over during the recess and whispered, Where'd you get that Venmo log? Jack didn't smile. I didn't. Claire did. She passed it to me anonymously this morning. Jasmine blinked. She crossed the line for you. Jack shook his head. No. She crossed it for truth. Later, Claire summoned both legal teams to chambers. She locked the door behind her. I don't need to remind either of you that what happened today is grounds for mistrial. Griggs began to protest, but she cut him off. You, Mr. Griggs, have two choices. Withdraw voluntarily and salvage your career, or keep pushing and risk disbarment. My clerks are preparing transcripts for the ethics board either way. Griggs was silent, then stormed out. Claire turned to Jack and Jasmine. I'm not here to help you, she said. But I'll no longer pretend neutrality means blindness. Jack looked at her, not with victory. With respect. The kind you give a fellow soldier when the bullets are flying, and they step forward anyway. That night, Jack sat in his cell as thunder rolled again in the distance. But inside him something else stirred. Not relief, not hope, conviction. Because now he knew the courtroom was no longer a trap. It was a battlefield. And finally, he wasn't fighting alone. The courtroom was silent. No whispers, no papers rustling, no shifting in seats. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that came before a verdict, or before a moment no one would ever forget. Jack Dawson stood alone at the center of the room. No defense attorney at his side, no script, no slideshow. Just a man in a white shirt with sleeves rolled to the forearms standing before 12 strangers, and a judge who once knew him better than he knew himself. Claire Whitmore sat high above him on the bench, eyes unreadable, but her grip on the gavel had loosened. She didn't want to stop this, and neither did anyone else. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Jack began, his voice, low, steady, stripped of performance. I'm not here to repeat evidence. He paused. You've seen the facts. You've heard the contradictions. You've watched a system twist itself into a shape that no longer resembles the justice we're supposed to believe in. He looked up at the jurors, at Claire, at Ellie. But I'm not standing here today to beg for your mercy, because I don't need mercy. He took a breath. What I need, what we all need, is something far more dangerous than mercy. Truth. He began to walk slowly, deliberately across the courtroom floor, like a man who had marched through darker rooms before. I spent 15 years in uniform, 9 deployments, 7 in classified operations. I've stood in sandstorms with bullets overhead, and orders in my hand that made no moral sense, just strategic ones. I followed them anyway. His eyes scanned the room. But I came back here thinking I could leave that part behind, that I could be a father, a janitor, a man who fixes leaks and eats his lunch alone, and shows up at every parent-teacher conference. He paused again. His voice softened. You know what's harder than war? Trying to explain to your daughter why people look at you like you're broken when you're just trying. He looked at the jury again, eyes burning with quiet fire. I didn't rob that gas station. I didn't assault that officer. I didn't run because I'm guilty. I ran because I've spent my entire life watching what happens when people wait too long to move. A beat. You've been told I'm dangerous, that I'm trained to harm, that I'm hiding something. His jaw tightened. Well, here's what I've been hiding. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a photograph worn at the edges. He held it up. A picture of Ellie, age 6, sitting on his shoulders, waving a tiny American flag. That's the only mission I care about now. The jury was still. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Claire felt her throat tighten. But Jack wasn't finished. He turned back toward her, toward the bench, not with defiance, but with a kind of reverence. I know I disappointed you, he said quietly. I disappeared when I should have stayed. I stopped believing that dreams had a place in courtrooms. He stepped back into the center. But standing here now, under oath, under judgment, I remember what we used to say under that magnolia tree. He looked at her directly. That the law is nothing without the people brave enough to carry it forward. He turned one last time to the jury. I don't want your sympathy. I don't need a second chance. I just ask you this. He paused, letting the silence breathe. If I were your brother, your son, your father, would you still believe what they told you? Or would you look at everything and ask one simple question? What if he's telling the truth? Jack stepped back. I rest my case. Silence. Not a cough. Not a breath. Claire couldn't move. Her hand hovered near the gavel, but it felt almost wrong to break the spell. Jack turned and walked back to his table, empty now, except for the drawing Ellie had placed there before court began. She had drawn him again, not in chains, but standing beside her, under a tree, smiling. Claire's voice finally found its way out. This court will recess until the jury has reached its verdict. She tapped the gavel once, but the echo felt different, like something had shifted. As the jury filed out, Claire sat motionless. Jasmine stood quietly in the back, eyes glassy. Even Grigg, still present under obligation, seemed deflated, like a man who realized he'd been playing checkers in a chess game he never understood. And Jack, he simply sat, like he'd already won something greater than the verdict. After the courtroom emptied, Claire stayed behind. She walked slowly down the steps of the bench, past the rail to the defense table. She stood across from Jack, eyes locked. Neither said anything for a long time. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. You didn't just defend yourself. Jack tilted his head. No, you defended what we used to believe in. He smiled faintly. Someone had to. She reached out, and with careful fingers straightened the corner of Ellie's drawing. Then, without looking at him, she said, No matter what verdict they bring back, I want you to know. Her voice caught. You reminded me why I ever put on the robe in the first place. Jack's expression softened. Then it was worth everything, and for the first time since the trial began, Claire smiled, a quiet, trembling smile, because whether the law agreed or not, justice had already been heard. The jury took 6 hours, not because the evidence was unclear, not because the law was complicated, but because what they were about to decide wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about courage, about fear, about the terrifying power of saying, we believe him. Claire Whitmore sat alone in her chambers. The courtroom lights dimmed. Her robe folded neatly over the back of a leather chair. For most of her career, she had trained herself to remain still in moments like these. But today, her hands trembled slightly. Not from nerves, From weight. The weight of every choice that led them here. The knock came soft. 3 taps. She stood robe back on face, composed. A bailiff opened the door. "They're ready, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed like a low electrical hum as the jury filed in. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen. Jasmine sat behind Jack, her fingers clasped tight. Griggs looked like a man waiting to be sentenced himself. And Jack Dawson stood as the clerk called for all to rise, his chin high, shoulders square. Calm, but not because he didn't care, because he had already made peace long before the verdict. Claire took her seat on the bench, her voice steady, but lower than usual. As the jury reached a unanimous verdict, the foreman, a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a gaze like tempered steel rose. "We have Your Honor. Please read it." The moment stretched like glass. On the count of armed robbery, the foreman read, "We the jury find the defendant Jackson Dawson not guilty." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Jack didn't move. On the count of assaulting a law enforcement officer, she continued, "We find the defendant not guilty." Another pause. "On all remaining charges, we find the defendant not guilty." Silence. And then, a breath. A release. Like the entire courtroom had exhaled for the first time in days. Claire's voice cracked just slightly. "Mr. Dawson, you are hereby exonerated of all charges. The court orders your immediate release." She turned to the bailiff. "Remove the restraints." Jack extended his hands, and the cuffs were unlocked for the final time. He looked down at his wrists, rubbed the skin there. Then slowly he looked up at Claire. Their eyes met. And this time, neither looked away. Claire stood. A breach of protocol, a break in tradition. And then quietly, with the dignity of someone shedding years of distance, she stepped down from the bench. The courtroom fell silent again, everyone watching, everyone knowing. She walked past the prosecution table, past the jury box, stopping only when she reached Jack at the defense table. There were no words, just the echo of a time long ago beneath a magnolia tree, where justice was still a dream between 2 kids, with notebooks and stars in their eyes. She extended her hand. Jack took it. Not in victory, in recognition. Ellie burst through the gallery rail the moment the gavel came down. Daddy Jack turned just in time to catch her in his arms. He lifted her off the ground as she wrapped her arms tight around his neck, face buried into his shoulder. "I told them you didn't do it," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart," he said. "You never stopped believing." Tears slid silently down his cheek as he held her. And across the room, hardened reporters dabbed their eyes behind press badges. Outside flashbulbs exploded. Cameras rolled. But Jack didn't stop for them. He held Ellie's hand and walked down the courthouse steps, like a man stepping out of a shadow for the first time in years. Beside him, Claire kept her distance until they reached the bottom. She paused, waiting for the crowd to quiet. Then softly, she stepped to his side. Jack glanced over, and Claire asked barely above the noise, "Do you remember what you said to me the night before you left for Kandahar?" He smiled. "I said if I got a second chance, I'd never waste it." She nodded. "Do you still believe that he looked down at Ellie, back up at her?" "I do now." They stood there, 3 people who had once been fragments now standing in the same frame. Not perfect, not fixed, but whole. That night, in a quiet diner miles away from the courthouse, Jack sat across from Claire and Ellie. He wasn't in a jumpsuit. He wasn't on defense. He was just Jack. A man who had once been a name on a docket now. Just a father. Just a man with his life back. Ellie slid a drawing across the table. A new one. This time, it was the 3 of them. Under a tree. Together. It was Sunday afternoon in Baton Rouge, and the world felt like it had exhaled. No gavel, no headlines, no whispers behind courthouse doors. Just the sound of birds in oak branches and the distant hum of traffic beyond the park. Jack Dawson stood beneath the magnolia tree, the same kind that had once shaded two kids who believed they could change the world, the same kind that had watched them part, and now perhaps the same kind that would witness something begin again. He reached up, letting a fallen blossom fall into his palm. It was soft white, wide open, like forgiveness. Behind him, footsteps approached. Slow, familiar. Claire Whitmore walked toward him, her shoes clicking gently on the stone path. No robe, no bench. Just a woman in a slate-gray dress, hair loose for the first time in years, carrying a folded piece of paper in her hand. Jack turned. Their eyes met. There was no courtroom between them now. No rules, no shields. Only history. And what they might do with it next. I found this, Claire said, softly unfolding the paper. You left it under the magnolia tree before you deployed. 17 years ago. He looked down. It was a letter. His handwriting. He had written it the night before he shipped out, unable to face her, unable to trust that the war wouldn't hollow him out. Claire read aloud, If I come back and you're still here, I want to find that tree again. Not to rewrite what we lost, but maybe to remember who we were when we still believed in things. She looked up. You still believe? Jack didn't speak for a moment. Then he looked out toward the water. I didn't for a long time, he said. But then a little girl drew me like I was still worth something. And a woman I thought I'd lost reminded me that justice has a heart. He turned to her. I do now. Claire stepped closer. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Do you remember, she asked, what you said the first time you kissed me? Jack smiled. I said, we'll never lose each other. She nodded. You were wrong. He agreed. But maybe now, we get to prove me wrong again. Ellie ran up, then breathless, holding a small brown box. I finished it. Claire crouched beside her, finished what Ellie opened the box, and revealed a homemade nameplate, cardboard markers, and tape. It read, Jack Dawson, father, hero, free man. Jack laughed softly, heart swelling. Claire looked at the lettering, then up at Ellie. You know, I think he needs something else on there. Ellie tilted her head, like what Claire met Jack's eyes. Second chance. That evening they sat on a bench overlooking the river. Jack, Claire, Ellie between them, her legs dangling. No plans, no pressure, just stillness, just presence. The sun lowered, painting the water gold. The wind tugged at Claire's hair. Jack took a deep breath, the kind that reached all the way to the ribs, and loosened something that had been locked inside for years. I don't know where this goes, Claire said. Neither do I, Jack replied. But I know I don't want to run anymore. She looked at him. And I'm tired of hiding behind a bench. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But they didn't need to. Because some things don't begin with fireworks. They begin with returning. The next morning, Jack took Ellie to school for the first time in months. She clutched his hand the entire walk to the gate. Other parents whispered. Some smiled. Some watched. But Jack only saw one thing, Ellie turning back before she walked inside, whispering, You're still my hero. Later that week, Claire walked into her courtroom. She sat on the bench again. But something was different. The walls felt less rigid, the air less sterile, the robe less heavy. She opened the session with the same words she'd said for years. But now when she looked at the defendant in front of her, some kid with shaky hands and a scared mother in the gallery, she saw something else. She saw Jack. And she spoke with a little more patience, a little more mercy, a little more heart. That night, she returned to the magnolia tree. Jack was already there fixing the plaque Ellie had made to a wooden post nearby. It read, Here once two kids dreamed of justice. One fought for it. One guardian returned to it. This is their tree. Claire stood beside him. I think we owe that tree everything. Jack smiled. I think that tree was always waiting for us. They stood there until the stars blinked into view, silent witnesses above, and as the wind rustled the magnolia leaves, a voice seemed to rise from the branches. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a promise that no matter how far we fall, how far we run, or how long we stay silent, there's always a place for second chances. Before you go, we'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. Let us know in the comments below. Your stories and voices truly inspire us. And if this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story so you won't miss the next one. We share powerful, uplifting stories just like this. Stories that remind us that kindness, truth, and second chances still matter. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. We're so grateful you're here.